In this video, we will talk about what you need to think about when you are processing and storing personal data. And I will in a minute define what I mean by personal data and what it means to process and store personal data. But before we get there, we need to look at the legal framework that we deal with when we are processing and storing personal data. This is what is called the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. It's an EU-wide regulation that provides a requirement for how to process personal data. And in Norway, it is the Norwegian Center for Research Data, or NSD, that is responsible for assessing research projects that process personal data and making sure or advising researchers on how to process and store personal data in a way that complies with the requirements laid out in the General Data Protection Regulation. And when you are a master student conducting a master thesis project, you also have to deal with these regulations. So let's look at the definitions here. What does it mean to process personal data? Personal data, that's any information that's relating to an unidentified or identifiable person. All the quotes here are taken from the website of the National Center for Research Data, the NSD. Personal data, we can divide that up into directly identifiable personal data. That's your name, social security number, or other uniquely personal characteristics. And then there's indirectly identifiable personal data. That's any kind of background information that, when put together, can be used to identify a person. That could be place of residence, institutional affiliation, age, gender, occupation, medical diagnosis, etc., etc. So for instance, even if not using my name, if you mention that there's a female teacher and researcher working at MF who is in her 30s, and she has one child and started working at MF in 2016. I'm more or less the only person that fits all those characteristics, and even if you do not mention my name, I can be identified. And having that data about me would then be considered processing personal data, because processing personal data involves not just publishing it in a master thesis, but collecting that data, registering it in some way, storing it, putting it together, or handing it out or publishing it in some way or other. There's also a last concept or term that you need to be aware of, which is called special categories of personal data, or used to be called sensitive data, and people still call it sensitive data, although the official term is special categories of personal data. And that's information relating to racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, health, sex life, or sexual orientation. And if in your research project you collect or process personal data relating to one or several of these topics, you are processing sensitive data, special categories of personal data, and there's some special precautions that you need to take when it comes to how you process and store the data that you are dealing with. One concrete way that these rules about processing personal data applies to you is the NSD notification form. Because if in your research project, in your master thesis, you will process personal data, you have to submit a notification form to the NSD. And in that notification form, you have to state the topic of your research, what kind of research methods you're using, what kind of data material, your sampling, what kind of people will you observe, what kind of text will you analyze, what kind of people will you interview, how will you recruit these people, how will you store the data, how will you analyze it, etc. And you have to send in and have this notification form approved by the NSD before you can collect your data. And getting that approval usually takes at least a month. So that means that you have to start thinking about these things well in advance of actually doing your data collection. There are certain ways that you can avoid having to submit this notification form. Some forms of textual analysis would not require you to submit this form, especially if you are analyzing texts that are considered public and openly available. You would not need to submit a notification form. If you don't record your interviews and only take written notes, and there's no written signatures on a consent form or any kind of written information that can be used to identify your research participants, you're not processing personal data. But in most cases, in many cases, you will need to submit this form. And I have, in our Canvas room, I have included a lot of links to where you can find more information about this notification form. Lastly, what I want to talk about in this video is how to store your research data in a safe way. I don't know how you usually store your information on your laptop or your phone, but when you're dealing with personal data that you're collecting as part of a research project, you have to make sure that it's safely stored so that information is not being leaked or made available to other people who should not get access to this information. There is a document called Standard Procedures for Storage of Research Data at MF, which I have linked to in the Canvas room for this course, that you should read and make yourself familiar with. I will give you some of the highlights of that document that you need to be aware of, but read the whole document as well to get all the details. First of all, don't store personal data in the cloud. If you're using Google Drive, Apple storage systems, what are all these things called? Dropbox, other kinds of cloud-based storage systems, don't store personal data there, because you do not have full control of who can access the data. Store it in a safe space, and the cloud-based storage system is then not considered safe. You can store personal data on your own laptop if you follow certain criteria or requirements. First of all, it should be small amounts of data. It's usually okay if you're doing a master thesis project, because there's a limit to how much data you would store. You can also store personal data on your own laptop if you don't have any special categories of personal data or no sensitive data. And you must also then make sure that your laptop or computer, that you have a password protection, that if you were sharing this laptop with a friend, a family member, a boyfriend, girlfriend, or other people, that you have separate accounts, so that this friend or your mother or boyfriend, whoever, cannot access your interview files or your observation notes or other kind of personal data, that you have proper antivirus program installed, etc., to make sure that you don't lose personal data. If you're processing special categories of personal data, this sensitive data, there's some special precautions that you need to do. You have to make a data management plan, and you have to do a risk and security analysis to make sure that you know how to store your data safely. And I will also link to these documents, both the data management plan and the risk and security analysis, in the Canvas room, so you can check them out. And all these things related to processing and storing personal data, and also research ethics in general. There's a lot of quite difficult questions that can arise. And use your supervisor to help you to think through these things. That's one of the reasons you have a supervisor, that you should not feel that you have to come up with the answers to all these dilemmas, find out how to deal with all these things yourself. You're responsible for reading the documents we provide to you, trying your best to figure out how to do this, and then ask your supervisor for help to make sure that you follow the guidelines and rules and regulations that we expect of you.